Great. And so I have given a brief intro on all three of you there. So maybe we should start there, though. It's probably better in your words than mine. So maybe just take a couple of minutes there, Brittany, Nicole, and Darren, just to kind of say who you are and where you're coming from and a little bit of background, and then we'll get into the presentations proper.
Do you want me to start, Mark? Okay. My name is Brittany Maguire. I'm currently located in Toronto. I used to work for the Atlantic Canadian Organic Regional Network, or ACORN, as probably most of you know about by now. The reason why I'm giving this presentation today is because at the time we had been hearing from farmers that they wanted to know more about what was going to happen with climate change and a better understanding of how to start thinking about it and how to start dealing with it. So I put together some educational materials at the time, and some of this information that I'm going to share today comes from that. I'm currently the Senior Good Food Program Lead at Meal Exchange, a national charity focused more on post-secondary student food insecurity and food justice and other aspects of food. So that's me, and excited to be here. I was here last year too, so.
Claire and I caught Brittany's presentation, I think it was back in 2018, and that's when I first moved to this area. And I thought everything you said was bang on, and everything you said so far I've seen, and every year coming. Like, I realized some of these projections were for further, but before you just got on, we were saying that like right now we're in the yesterday and today we're in the 40s over here with humidity. The last rain event we had here was about a week ago, and we got almost 2 inches of rain all at once. Like, it was over a course of a day, mind you, but still, it was a lot of rain for like a single day. And it's exactly what your climate change predictions there that you shared we're pointing to, and that's where we're at. It's happening. Thanks, Brittany.
I can go next. We'll go in the order. Guest image will appear. My name is Nicole Arsenault, and I'm a PhD candidate at Dalhousie University here in Halifax. I come at these questions mostly from modeling perspective. My PhD research involves modeling possible future scenarios for production and consumption of food in Canada at a national scale for 2030 and 2050. I'm just launching into that now, completing my research proposal, so I can't tell you anything about what my findings are. But I do have a background in food systems modeling. I did model dairy system and some fishing systems in the past, and I'm back in academia after many years away in the nonprofit sector working for a land trust. I also have a background in biology and education, so I really appreciate these opportunities to speak to sustainability questions from an interdisciplinary perspective.
Super great. I'm really looking forward to hearing both you, Nicole, and Darren, because I've never caught your presentations yet, so I'm really looking forward to that. And Darren, I'll let you wrap up there with the introduction.
Sure. Thanks, Mark, Brittany, and Nicole. My name is Darren Qualman. I'm the Director of Climate Crisis Policy and Action with the National Farmers Union. The NFU is a national organization of farm families right across the country, members in every province and two territories. I'm a former farmer myself. In 2019, I wrote the report tackling the farm crisis and the climate crisis. And also in that year, I published a book called Civilization Critical: Energy, Food, Nature, and the Future.
And it occurs to me that you guys might not know my background. So I'm over here at Hayes Farm currently, and we are focusing on food security here and food sovereignty. We manage about just over an acre of market garden space, and currently expanding that as well. And then we also move most of our produce through 60 share CSA on a pay what you can model here in the local community. Previous to being at Hayes Farm, I used to manage a farm out in Ontario in the Kawartha Lakes area. It was a 100-acre farm, but we managed about a 10-acre vegetable plot there. And yeah, selling a lot of things down into Toronto, selling them at prices that my family couldn't afford to buy, to be honest. And that really ate me up. And that's how I ended up here at Hayes Farm. So all that being said, from what I understand of your various segments of your presentation, I think it makes most sense for Brittany to go first. Then we can move on to Nicole, and then I'm hoping Darren's going to be our ray of sunshine at the end here with the move towards a zero emission farm. Does that sound all right?
The order sounds fine. I can impersonate a ray of sunshine, but most of the time what I have to say is a bit concerning, but yeah.
But I like the image of that near zero emission farm. You know what I mean? And I like that as having a goal to move towards. It seems to me that it's a hopeful note to end on, as opposed to keep going down, as opposed to ending on Brittany's say, you know?
I'm just gonna figure out how to share my screen here. Just one second.
Yeah. That's good.
Does that work okay?
Yeah.
Perfect. It's okay if I start?
Yes, please.
Great. So you already know this about me. My contact information is there if you want to get in touch at all. I'll share these slides afterwards, Mark, so that you can share them back out. Does that sound good?
Yeah, sounds great.
I don't think I prepared this for last year when I had a bit much more time. I don't think I'm going to be able to get through it all today, but I decided to keep it all just because I think there's a lot of interesting information here that'll be useful if you want to refer back to it. So I'll send the slides and you can explore them on your own. Also, just a note, I am no expert in these things. Like I tried to learn about, I do have a background in environmental science, but I tried to learn more about climate change and farming while working with Acorn. And so I've done my best to interpret the models, not actually learning ever in school how to do that in order to put these things together. But I just wanted to name that. So what I've got in this presentation is a little bit about like climate modeling. What does it mean? Why are we looking at them? What to expect as the climate changes, specifically in New Brunswick, relying on some government information from there. And then what does this mean for farms? A little bit about farm resilience and adaptation planning, but I'm sure that you guys are covering a lot of that in the Hayes Farm curriculum otherwise. And then a bunch of links on where to find some more information. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is climate models. So we're looking at representative concentration pathways, which were created by the IPCC to project different climate futures. These pathways depend on potential emission scenarios and land use changes, and which impact greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere, and then impact the climate change scenarios that we're seeing. So the government of New Brunswick has projections, local climate projections for the province based on two scenarios, 4.5, which is a medium emission scenario, and then 8.5, which is a high emissions. And you can explore like the process that they used for downscaling that information to the local projections on the link that I've got there in the middle of the slide afterwards. I'm going to be showing you a bunch of information from some government website from New Brunswick, which I've tried to click on it last night and no longer seems to exist. So I don't know what's going on there. Maybe they're updating the information and maybe this is a bit outdated, but last year I downloaded the various slides that you're going to see from their different, from the website where you could explore what would happen going forward. But the link's here. Yeah, Mark.
It's always a little suspicious when government takes information down, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, as long as you're feeling the same there.
It also, my experience in New Brunswick is that sometimes things would disappear and then come back up the same. So I'm not quite sure. I have a friend who works in the department, so I asked her last night and she said, oh, I'm going to see what's going on. So maybe a link got broken or something. I don't know. But yeah, I think it's important to look at the government websites, the Department of Environment and Local Government. They have a climate change unit, I think, and they've got lots of information. Not all of it's on the website. So if you have any questions, it's great to reach out to them. So we're not going to go into this in too much detail, but you can look at this afterwards just to say that the 4.5 that we're going to show, it's going to show two different scenarios for each thing that we're talking about, one 4.5, one 8.5. The 4.5 is a medium emission scenario. So we're talking about carbon dioxide emissions peaking by 2040. And you can see that in the graph there. And then we're talking about the highest emission scenario for 8.5, where CO2 emissions continue to rise. And this impacts what happens. So one of the things that Mark was just referring to is that precipitation in the Maritimes, and specifically in New Brunswick, is expected to increase. So in the form of rain, snow, and freezing rain. And it's expected to occur in more intense events, but then with like longer periods without water, with drought in between. And so you can see that happening. So these slides have what was observed from 1981 to 2010 based on weather stations. There's also kind of a lack of weather information in the Maritimes. And so, yeah, that's just good to be aware of. I know that when I was in New Brunswick, people were talking about getting more information or more weather stations, but I don't know where that landed. And then here we have the horizon. This information is a few years old. So the horizon was 2020 that you're seeing in the second box there. And so some of these things are already coming to pass, like the increased precipitation. And then here at the end is for 2050. And so you just see that the darker blue continues to get darker there, specifically in certain spots. Of course, these are just projections, so it's not to say that this is exactly what for sure is going to happen in this exact way at this exact time, but I think they help to plant the idea of what's going to happen. So this is for the high emission scenario, again, for the 8.5, RCP 8.5. Basically, in the high emission scenario, the increase in precipitation is just going to happen sooner, so this decade. This is for summer, but when the Government of New Brunswick website for projections is up and running, hopefully again, you can also explore like overall annual precipitation, winter, spring, and fall. But what I've got here for summer, and it just shows that it's going to keep happening sooner. So these are just some pictures, one from Hayes Farm, actually, that I got from Claire, I think in 2017, 2018, and then from Guy from Ferme Jean Levant down in near Sackville. Yeah, so that just shows a lot of precipitation that happened that summer. I think that was 2018. Yeah, so we're also looking, again, with another water issue, increases in sea level rise due to climate change, in addition to increases in storm frequency and severity, which all contribute to the risk of coastal flooding. Of course, there's also been issues with inland flooding in New Brunswick in the last few years as well. You can actually get maps that project the risk of your land to experience an extreme flood and where it might go on your property if you reach out to the Regional Service Commission and provide them with your parcel identification number. Not everyone does that, but it's really useful either if you're thinking about purchasing some land or if you have land and want to think about where you might want to deal with some drainage issues and things like that. Really useful. This is just one that I got for Hillsborough. There's also, when I was living in New Brunswick, there was a EOS and a few other NGOs were doing flooding information nights where you could go and actually like learn about where the flooding would happen in your town if there was, storms and sea level rise. So I attended one of those for Sackville, and it was really informative. So if you hear about those, I highly recommend going for your region. So another thing that's expected to change and increase as climate changes is the growing season. So they're expected to increase in length. So this is for medium emission scenario. And you can already see that. I mean, you're talking about really high temperatures happening right now, Mark. Yeah, and so similarly for high emission scenario, the growing season length is supposed to be even greater in time frame and geographical extent of the province around 2050. So you see it's like dark orange down at the bottom there, 2050. Again, you can explore these slides afterwards to look in more detail. We also can talk about growing degree days, which are a measure of heat accumulation, and these are expected to increase as the climate changes. And then in the high emission scenario, this is going to increase once again in 2050, so higher than what would be projected for the medium emission scenario. And speaking about what you're speaking about, so the hot days, as well as there's a measure of very hot days that you can explore. Both of those things are expected to increase on average, very hot days and hot days, the number of them. And then when you look at the high emissions scenario, those are going to increase in the number and geographical extent of the province. So of course, this could impact crops that are sensitive to temperature, or high temperature, I should say. So I just presented a variety of different factors that are expected to change, and you can explore more of them once the government website's up and back and running, as well as on Climate Atlas, which is a website that I've got linked later in the presentation. So what does this all mean for farms? So we've got longer growing seasons, more growing degrees, which potentially could increase farm productivity and offer new opportunities for crops. However, I would caution against that because there's going to be, or already is, a greater variability that we're seeing in way more unpredictable weather patterns and extreme weather events that obviously negatively impact farms. This includes things like late frost, which I know that you've seen out there and we've seen here. We just had snow a few weeks ago. Early frost and snow, longer periods of drought, more hot and very hot days, heavier rainfalls with then drought in between, stronger storms and winds, coastal and inland flooding, and all of this changes the weed and pest pressures, crop diseases, all sorts of things. So I think that the key here is that there's a lot of unpredictability to deal with. So one way to start to think about how to adapt to that is to focus on farm resilience. So the ability for a farm to be resilient to these impacts that it might be experiencing. So to respond and adapt to changes is a really key piece of this. One fundamental part of resilience is soil health. So increasing soil organic matter can improve soil health and the ability for your farm to withstand both wet and dry conditions. To improve soil structure, farms are experimenting with things like decreasing the amount that they till their land. I know you guys know all this stuff from your experience at Hayes anyways, but just to recap why it's so important for thinking about climate adaptation. So covering the soil with cover crops, protecting the soil from erosion is really important when we're thinking about high rains and really heavy winds, especially in some parts of the province. Adding nutrients back into the soil, improving soil structure. I guess a little ray of sunshine is also that increasing soil organic matter can increase the amount of carbon stored in the soil, which ultimately contributes to climate mitigation. So that's a slight ray of sunshine. Improved soil health also just helps the ability for soil to hold water, which is really important for the increase in droughts that we're expecting. So soil health helps with all of the different things that might be coming. Yeah, and then you can think of also about crop diversification and locally adapted seed. I think that's really important to think because if one of your crops is more sensitive to something that might happen than another, if you only have a limited number, you might be really hit hard if there's something that comes through like a new pest. But if you have a variety of crops that can help soil health, but that can also help with your financial ability to withstand some of these changes. Yeah, and erosion prevention is really important, like we talked about. So that's some of the things. Oops, I went back a slide.
I think it's great that you talk about those things because I often do, and it's nice to be able to hear it from another voice for everybody, I think.
Okay, great, perfect. Yeah, so obviously, as we talked about, we're talking about like increased storms, increased precipitation, and then droughts in between. So water management is incredibly important going forward and now. So Yeah, so thinking about, especially with the high volume of water, farms need to think about how to improve farm drainage. So yeah, you can do some of the things like ditching and landforming to redirect surface water to ponds, which then can hold the water for when you might need it during some of these times of drought that we talked about. Minimizing soil compaction. Also, some farms are deciding to do some drainage tile and pipe in order to redirect water off of the farm. So I have some pictures here from Guy Gautreau, who's on the board of Acorn, that did some of this stuff back in 2017 to deal with a lot of water that he was experiencing on the farm. And then I've linked a document from British Columbia here. They've got a lot of great documents that talk about all the different things that you can do to adapt to climate change and go into quite a bit of detail and information from other farms and stuff and images. So that's a great resource. Unfortunately, nothing really exists like that currently for the Maritime specifically. Yeah, so also talking about water management for drought. So farms need to think about how to make sure that they have water available when they have to go without rain. So you can think about more efficient irrigation so that you're using the water that you have more efficiently, collecting and storing farm water on the farm. So this can be done, like I talked about, in through landforming and ponds and things like that, but also through water collection tanks. And this picture is from another farm in New Brunswick, and I think you guys have one at Hayes Farm as well, if I remember correctly.
10.
You've got 10, great.
And it's nowhere near enough. And when you do the math on it about how much rain, I forget the numbers offhand, but like how much rain, like your ideal rainfall is about 1 inch per week for a market garden.
Okay.
And 1 inch of rain over an acre is, thousands of gallons. And our 10 tanks don't come anywhere close to 1 inch of rainfall for a week,
Yeah, wow. Yeah, that just speaks to how important it is to think about collecting water and using it efficiently then. And also making sure that your soil is in good health so that retain some of the water. I've linked again here to the BC Farm Practices document, which has a lot of information in there, but there's a lot of information online about this kind of stuff. Yeah, so I think another piece of this is just thinking about adaptation like a little bit more broadly. So learning from other farmers, I think, is a really key piece here. There are going to be things that you might read about online from other places in the country that might not be applicable for your particular location. I think there's within the Maritimes, there's a lot of microclimates. So it's really important to talk to the people near you, see what they're experiencing. Maybe they've come up with something really interesting and new. Yeah, so sharing experiences, talking to people, doing things like, I know harder during COVID, maybe we're on their way out, farm tours and conferences and connecting with your farmer organizations. When I was working with Acorn, I found that a lot of people were really worried about climate change, experiencing some anxiety, climate anxiety, they call it now, but were, for a variety of reasons, hesitant to talk to other people about it, maybe too anxious or felt that climate change was a political conversation or whatever, but then they weren't getting the opportunity to relieve some of their anxiety and also learn about some of the things that they could do to deal with it. So I think that's really important, is just start to talk to people, learn about what you can, use some of these maps, and get connected, especially when things happen, then you have a network of people to reach out to. I think it's also important for a farm to think about financial planning for the risk that you might be experiencing. This is a difficult time to get into farming. One aspect that came up when I was working at Acorn is talking about the importance of communicating with customers if you have a CSA. Like if a crop experiences damage and you don't have it in your basket, like maybe explain to your customers why. They probably don't know any of these things. So there's a little bit of public education and empathy there. Looking into insurance for things like crops and infrastructure. I know that I don't know too many details about it, but I think that it's pretty hard to find for small scale diverse farms. So maybe that's also an advocacy piece that's needed. Yeah, season extension infrastructure can help you deal with some of the changes in in weather that we're talking about, but they also need to be protected from high winds. I think it was in 2018 or 2019 that there was some high winds in southeast part of New Brunswick, and some greenhouses were taken down. So that's a word of caution. Those things are expensive, so protect them. Yeah, and then there's also government support that you can apply for. So New Brunswick has an environmentally sustainable agriculture program, and so did they might be called different things, but so did the other provinces in the Maritimes. So it's really, if you're thinking about investing in some of these things that can be quite expensive, like let's say more efficient irrigation or water collection tanks and things like that, or even, new machinery for cover crops, whatever, all sorts of things, there is government support available. So apply for it, reach out to get support to put your application together. Yeah, and then, and I'm going over time, sorry, I'm almost done. This is just a list of where to look for more information. So like I said, the Department of Environment and Local Government is a really great resource. You can reach out to the agricultural department as well. I looked at the BC information there as well, as a bunch of other things. I would suggest reaching out to farmer organizations in your area or even nationally. And also you could start to think about if there are climate organizations like EOS and ACAP in St. John, but also different watershed NGOs. Like they've done a lot of work with landowners, protecting stream banks and things like that. And I think I had met a number of them when I was in New Brunswick that were interested in working with farmers. So that's something to think about if you're experiencing some like coastal flooding issues or some erosion on stream banks and things like that. And that's it. I'll stop there, but I'll share this so you can look through everything afterwards.
That was super great. I love that. That's why I keep asking you back. Before I jump in, does anybody in the class here have any questions in our virtual class? Brittany, you mentioned about government support, and that tweaked my interest because I am a big fan of cover cropping. That's actually a project we're going to be working on Thursday here on farm. We'll be doing a cover crop cocktail in one of our gardens. I am also a big fan of no-till. However, with the present gear that I have here at the farm available to me, we will be tilling. Actually, the area's already been primary. I've already done a primary till out there in order to establish this cover crop. But where I would like to go is towards crimping, growing a cover crop and then crimping that cover crop and then planting through that and using it as mulch without having to till it in. What is preventing me from doing that is the equipment. From what I understand, it's actually very hard to come by in Atlantic Canada. I had somebody that was looking into it and it had to be imported from Europe. Do you think, from what you know about that government support, do you think they would be into investing in something like that?
I think they could be. Here, I'll send you this is the document that I had before. I'll put it in the chat so you guys can check it out. It'd be worth to make sure that this is the most up to date for New Brunswick. But I think so, especially I think that there's been funding for farms specifically, but sometimes there's also funding for like are you guys like a nonprofit? I can't remember.
Yep.
So that also makes you available probably for not only this funding, but a variety of other funding. So I think it's worth to think about. I was also just thinking that I know Hayes Farm had the infrastructure for crimping. Not Hayes, sorry, Broad Fork.
See now, the scale that we operate at, we have a BCS here. That's all we have. So we don't have full-on tractor in order to pull behind a crimper. But there is a crimper machine that's available for the BCS, however expensive, and it needs to be imported.
I see.
And so that's something I would like to look into because for the scale that we operate at, it's really hard, especially being in town, it's really hard to get anybody out here with a tractor just to do, a 1/10 of an acre parcel at a time.
Totally. Yeah, I think that would be really worth looking at the funding that I just put in the chat. There also might be new funding available. Like this is what I found a couple of years ago, but or maybe a year ago now. But yeah, there's a lot of funding out there if you start.
And I think I want to follow up with Broad Fork there and find out their experiences with their crimper there too.
Yeah, they shared some pictures with me a few years ago of what was going on there. So, and I think they might have posted a video or something online.
A fella I know just a week ago was doing hand crimping. I didn't know that was a thing you can do using like boards, and he had this little setup he had going on, and I wanted to follow up to find out how successful he was with that one.
Oh, that's interesting.
All right, so again, I'll put a shout out for any questions before we move on to Nicole here. All right, Nicole, I think the floor is yours.
All right, let me just share my screen here. And I can't. Okay, here we go. Let's see. Can we all see that?
Yep, looks good.
Okay. So as I said before, I'm here doing an interdisciplinary PhD at Dalhousie University. I come at these problems from a modeling and ecological economics kind of perspective, considering every part of the human economy as a subsystem of the environment. I always also try to keep in mind that our sustainability decision-making, these are all ethical decisions that we are making. And so, especially when, you know, I have the benefit of speaking to this issue from a global perspective, which, because we know the impacts of climate change will not be distributed evenly across the world, and that the global south will suffer and are suffering more of these impacts. And we know that, as Brittany was showing, agricultural zones are going to be moving northward. And so there may be opportunities here for Canada and loss of opportunity in the global south. So how we distribute food in the future will also be a big concern. And what we decide to eat and how we produce it is certainly part of that. So I'm going to today break my talk into 6 sections, hopefully get through pretty quickly. I'm first going to just talk about what the food system is in terms of how I'm conceiving of it for this talk, and cover the basics around what greenhouse gases are emitted by the food system and when and how, very quickly. Then we're going to talk very big picture, very big picture for this entire talk, actually, very big picture. What are the sort of best estimates we have for the global food system's contribution to climate change? And then within that, within the food system, where are the hotspots of greenhouse gas emissions? Where are the majority of those emissions from the food system coming from? Then before I talk about what we can do, and actually I'm not going to dwell on this, on what we can do too much, because then we're going to be hearing Darren speak, and we're going to be looking forward to opportunities for making food systems more sustainable from a climate change perspective. So I won't talk too much about that, but before I do that, I'm going to talk about the other impacts that the global food system and local food systems contribute to, so that we have in our minds not just a single issue, that we have the whole planetary system, and that we understand that sometimes interventions that we may make to address one impact to climate change may have unintended consequences across other impacts. And so, and conversely, may have synergy. So these are important things to keep in mind. Then we'll talk a little bit about what we can do. So what even am I talking about when I say the food system? When I and many food and sustainability scholars talk about the food system, we're not just discussing agricultural systems, although those are incredibly important, as we'll see later. But the food system is much more complex, multidimensional, and multidimensional than that. The four main domains are, of course, farming and agriculture. There's the environment, from which we derive many ecosystem services, and also into which we emit emissions and also use resources from our environment. These are also, this food system is also a very social system in that food is very cultural, historical, it's very important human societies, in addition to being something we need for nutrition and well-being. And of course, the food system is an economic system. And for many of us, the sort of murky dynamics of a global the financials of the food system are very tricky to navigate, difficult to understand, and also tricky to think about how we as individuals or as communities can have an impact there. Each of these domains of this food system contains drivers of environmental impacts, and they interact in ways that are complex and sometimes hard to predict and fairly uncertain. And so as we intervene in different places in the system, that's going to have potentially known and potentially unknown impacts across the whole system and across local, national, and global scales. So what are the greenhouse gases that are emitted from the food system? Broadly speaking, they are CO2, they are nitrous oxide, they are methane. And these are emitted at different places along the food system. Of course, fossil fuel combustion is used for energy across the entire and all four domains of the food system. We also have the on-farm biogenic emissions of greenhouse gases from agricultural systems. These are greenhouse gases that are emitted as a result of sort of the biological functioning of the system itself. And so these include nitrous oxide, which is a very potent greenhouse gas that's emitted as a result mainly of the disturbance of soils, the application of both industrial fertilizers, but also animal manure fertilizers. So some of the excess nitrogen is lost into the air. Nitrous oxide is a very potent greenhouse gas. Methane is also emitted by, of course, we all know the enteric fermentation of ruminants, also animal manure, and also from the decomposition of organic matter and from soils. And carbon dioxide is both lost from the soils and, as I'm sure we'll hear more about later, soils sequester carbon, and soils are a very important part of the carbon cycle. Land use change is an incredibly significant, as we'll see a little later on in my talk, incredibly significant source of greenhouse gas emissions globally. So the global demand for food and agricultural products is driving land use change around the world. And when forests and savannas, wetlands, etc., are converted to farmland, there's immediately a large loss of carbon dioxide from the soils as the soils are cultivated. Also, there's a loss of CO2 as a lot of that plant material that's being cleared is burnt. And as the cleared plant material is decomposing, there's methane emissions from those systems as well. So what's the big picture here? What is the global food system's aggregate contribution to climate change? This calculation is extremely difficult to make. Uncertainty and complexity, as we discussed earlier, abound across all the domains of the system. And in attempting to calculate, quantify greenhouse gas emission from the system, there is a great deal of uncertainty and variability. This is particularly true for the biogenic emissions that I talked about, so the emissions coming from the farms themselves. And that has to do a lot with the fact that those emission variability in those emissions is driven largely by climatic differences, by soil differences in soil, and differences in farming practices. So really these emissions can vary dramatically from farm to farm and from region to region. And so that, of course, represents an opportunity, but it also represents a challenge. So all of the estimates of global contribution of the food system to total greenhouse gas emissions are uncertain. There's a certain amount of variability that we have to take into account. But interestingly, despite differing methods, big studies that have been undertaken to take on this question, to answer this question, have come to fairly similar conclusions. So I think we have increasing confidence in what these estimates are telling us about the food system. So I'm going to focus my discussion of total impacts of the food system on climate change to two recent, two recent very high profile papers, both I think published in the journal Nature, both undertaking very ambitious projects to really get at an aggregate contribution of the global food system. And both, I mean, somewhat different for sure, but both relatively similar in final results. So what we're looking at for global contribution of the food system to climate change emissions, total climate change emissions from all of human society across the world, we're looking at approximately a quarter, according to the Poor and Nemechek calculation, up to a third, according to the Kripa et al. Calculation. That paper is just from this year. I'm going to dig a little bit, drill down a little bit into those two a bit more till we can see that, see where they're similar and where they're different and why that might be. And also so that we can see where are, you know, on all the steps of that, of the food system, all those various domains, where are the big heavy hitters of emissions? So this slide shows just a summary of the results from the Poor and Nemechek paper from 2018. And as you can see, the lion's share of contribution to total food system greenhouse gas emissions is coming from food production. This includes agriculture and aquaculture, and also in this case, and in the case of Kripa et al., capture fisheries are also captured here. So these include the fossil fuel emissions from that domain of the food system, as well as all the biogenic emissions. Interestingly, both papers made the decision to, instead of lumping the emissions associated with land use change in with agricultural production, in both cases, those emissions are separated out. And I think that that's quite important because you can see it's an incredibly significant contribution to total food system greenhouse gas emissions is land use change. Much of that land use change is being driven in the global south, but is answering demand from the global north and from large countries in Asia, like China, of course, where demand for food is very high. So again, certain countries are bearing a larger brunt of this impact than others. In the case of for Nemechek, they assign 60% of global deforestation to the food system, and they exclude non-food agricultural production in their estimate. And so you'll see that their estimate of land use change contribution is smaller than in the next paper, which we'll discuss. One thing that I wanted to point out, and certainly I don't want this to be interpreted as me saying we shouldn't buy local. I always have to make that caveat. But as you can see, transport's contribution. So this global transport of food and food system inputs around the planet is very much very small in comparison to the impact associated with agriculture production, and the land use change associated with that production. So the messaging around buy local is often centered around the impact that buying local will have on your individual climate change footprint. And I think that that's misleading when you look at the data. That it certainly is true that you're making a difference, but what you eat, as we'll see later, how it's produced matters more with respect to this single impact issue that we're talking about today. So let's look at the other paper here. So as you can see, the contribution from agriculture specifically now has a slightly less significant part to play, but if we combine this land use change and agriculture together, these are the impacts associated with, these are the emissions associated with food production. So still very, very significant, still adding up to 71%, whereas it added up to 84% here. But interestingly, what Kripa et al. Attempt to do is they include the land use change associated with some of the non-food agricultural production. And they also attempt to take into account post-retail greenhouse gas emissions in the food system. So these are after we get our food home from farmers market, from our CSA, from the grocery store, what's happening then? And what are the greenhouse gas emissions associated with what's happening then? And as we know, we are wasting food at rates far greater than perhaps we should, at least in terms of what food waste is avoidable. A lot of it may not be. Still, the impacts of waste are small in comparison with the impacts of agriculture production, and certainly the impacts of cooking, also fairly insignificant, not heavy hitters in this system, but still non-trivial when taken together, and so something to be taken into account. Looking at these two papers side by side, I think that they tell a very strong, they give us a very strong picture of where the heavy hitters in the food system are. And perhaps they aren't the places where we tend to think of most immediately. We think of sometimes very shocking distances that our food travels to get to our plate in countries like Canada, where we do import a substantial portion of the food that we eat and export a substantial portion of the food products that we produce. However, taken all together, those energy-driven and also biogenic-driven emissions from the agricultural production stage of the food system and from the massive amounts of land which are being converted for agricultural expansion. Those are the real hotspots globally that we need to be thinking about. You know, those are the big levers: production and land use change from this picture. But for the next session, I want to then, okay, so we've established that agricultural production extremely significant, land use change extremely significant. Let's drill down even further and let's look at the production of different food products and find where are those heavy hitters within agriculture. Now here, there simply isn't time to provide all the wealth of detail. There are thousands of models at this point. Since the 90s, globally, many studies have been devoted to modeling the life cycle impacts across not just climate change impacts, but across a variety of different impact categories of a huge variety of food production systems globally. And so researchers like Poor and Nemechek, like Europe and Albany, have been able to take advantage of and aggregate those data in order to get at these big picture conclusions about how the global food system is performing with respect to climate change and other impacts. And my research will also benefit from all of these data. We are also able now to compare across different categories of food, across, you know, all the different protein foods, the vegetables and fruit and other plant-based foods, and see which foods that we eat contribute more to impacts than others. That's not to say that they don't all play an important nutritional role and potentially agroecological role in the global food system. It is most certainly true that some foods that we eat have more associated greenhouse gas emissions than others. So the big heavy hitters that we find within, or within the agricultural systems and between different food products, and this is true both in local analyses and big global analyses where all of these studies are aggregated. 83% of the world's farmland is used for the production of meat, dairy, eggs, and fish. Those are terrestrial aquaculture systems. A huge portion of the massive amounts of land that we have converted as humans from wildlands to farmlands is used to produce animal foods. When we take land use change for livestock production expansion and emissions directly from livestock production systems together, 55% of the global food system's greenhouse gas emissions come solely from the production of livestock. And within livestock, not all livestock are the same either. Within that, ruminant meat production and dairy are the big drivers, both in terms of land conversion and from on-farm greenhouse gas emissions. Conversely, only 37% of global protein requirement for nutrition is supplied by these high impact systems. So many of the world system people are getting their protein other ways. And really the consumption of animal products is driven by high income affluent countries such as Canada. So that gives us something to chew on. And I'm going to talk a little bit about big levers that we can pull. But first, I want to just step away from climate change and talk briefly about other ways in which the global food system is a big part of humanity impinging upon and exceeding planetary boundaries and putting us into a scale which is beyond a sort of safe operating space for humanity in terms of maintaining our global life support systems. mitigating climate change is a huge and urgent priority. It's not only the adaptation that we need to do that Brittany was talking about, but also hopefully not getting to that 4.5 degree scenario, and certainly not 8.5 scenario. Those scenarios are hugely impactful for the global north, but they are devastating for the global south. So what else can we talk about? Biodiversity loss is the other big, gigantic way in which agriculture is changing the face of the planet. If we include agricultural production, land use change for agricultural expansion, and also the harvesting of wild species, and this is really particularly the harvesting of marine species for food, estimates put the food system's contribution to global biodiversity loss at 75 to 80%. That's significant. So feeding ourselves is the main driver for global biodiversity loss. Food systems are also a significant contributor to pollution, in particular acidifying and eutrophying. So this is nutrient pollution from agricultural systems, and also toxic pollution, although those impacts at a global scale are less well understood. Doesn't mean it's not significant, it's just less well understood. Food systems are big resource users, including water, but also all sort of industrial commodities go into the food system. Soil loss and degradation, I know that that's a big concern of the folks at Hayes Farm. It's a huge problem globally. It's absolutely urgent to address. And then there's the human. There's massive hunger and malnutrition across the world over, in our country, of course, and in low-income countries especially. So what can we do? Keeping all of these impacts in mind and remembering that we can't necessarily just apply solutions and interventions looking at one impact alone. We have to look across the whole system, and we have to consider where are potential synergies, where can we apply interventions and actually make things better across a number of different impacts, and where might there be trade-offs between our goals on climate change, mitigation and adaptation, and our goals on curbing biodiversity loss, reversing it, and making sure we're not undermining the life support systems that keep us alive. So I'm really hoping that Darren, you'll provide more detail here, because really at a global scale, there isn't a whole lot that we can say in terms of just simple, easy fixes that can be applied across the globe. There is no, from a global perspective, there is no single solution, no simple fix that can be applied across the globe universally. There's no current production system that addresses all environmental impacts well everywhere. Immense variability exists between different regions, different production systems, and their resultant impacts. And this variability is a challenge because it makes it hard to make these global determinations of impact. It's also an opportunity. This is where we need to dig in and figure out, why do some systems perform better than others across different impacts and different impacts? What can we learn from those systems? The global north and the wealthy countries of the world have been the largest recipients of the benefits from the Green Revolution and all that came with that, both good and bad. We need to retain some of those lessons that we've learned about increasing efficiency within food systems, and we need to apply them where they're applicable. Similarly, we need to look at alternative systems like organic, like generative, and say, what can we learn from this that can be applied globally so that we can continue to or improve how, feeding everybody, not just feeding some. And in my opinion, my strongly held opinion, and I hope that we can maybe get into more of a discussion about this, I'm finding that food system conversations can be very binary, pitting one kind of production against another. The conventional versus organic discussion is a really good example. Another really good example is from a biodiversity perspective, there's a big debate about land sharing versus land sparing. So land sharing would mean encouraging biodiversity on the farm and sharing as much as possible agricultural landscapes with local species. Land sparing is the perspective that no, what we actually need to do is we need to have far less land in cultivation and in farming altogether globally. We need to rewild a big chunk of that land. And we need to intensify the agricultural production so that we can farm on smaller amounts of land. And the truth is very likely to be that both of those perspectives are correct. That we need to look at places where we can intensify even further and feed more of the global population. And we need to look at places where maybe we need to be rewilding or doing more land sharing, where farm systems in really ecologically sensitive and important places of the world globally are done in a less intensive, more biodiversity friendly way. So these are, I think we need to get beyond these binary conversations and start learning from all our agricultural systems and applying those at a local scale where they're appropriate. From the individual and community perspective, and this is the question of what can I do as an eater? Your consumption absolutely matters. Your choices, your behaviors, and our collective choices and behaviors matter very much. And I've been thinking a lot actually about how COVID has shown us the degree to which we can come together to change for the common good, and how it's also shown us how inequitably the goods of the earth have been distributed among people, and how very close many people in our own country were to food insecurity when COVID hit. And it just tipped the balance, and now they're food insecure. So choosing to eat more sustainably is not only an environmental decision, it's an ethical one. It's a decision that, I agree it's important. Everybody on this planet needs to eat. So we've already talked about how animal foods, in particular ruminant meat and dairy, are the biggest drivers of greenhouse gas emissions, land use, and pollution to air, water, and soil among food products produced globally. So the biggest lever for a person individually, if they're concerned about climate change, they can pull, is to decrease their consumption of those foods. That's not to say that animal production systems don't play a really important role. They very well may, and it's difficult to imagine a system, a global food system without animals. But decreasing our consumption to sustainable levels, whatever that is, that's not figured out yet, but it's a lot less than what we're eating now in high-income countries. Decreasing the consumption of these animal foods, especially the highest impact, the beef, the dairy, is probably the single biggest lever an individual and a community and a family can do to address their own personal contribution to climate change from what they eat. And of course, it's also important to keep in mind that that's just one of many lifestyle decisions that we can make about mitigating our climate impact. Food is important, but it's not the only thing, and it's certainly not enough. So that's all I wanted to say. I hope I didn't go over time. Please feel free to be in touch. I'll also make sure I share these slides with Mark so that he can circulate them. You can check out my blog if you want to read more about my perspective. I did a lot of writing last year on these issues. Follow me on Twitter. Thanks.
Thank you, Nicole. I got a lot of things written down, I'll be honest, but I want to, again, throw it open to the class here and see if anybody's got any questions or any comments or anything they would like to add here.
I'm interested in your comment on the like buying local. Like, I think I agree. I think if, you know, we think that just buying local is going to fix everything, it's not. But I also wonder, like, if buying local would bring more awareness to those other impacts. So like, even if the transportation and the packaging, you know, isn't a huge impact, if it was going to be like your forest that was cut down to build more land instead of someone down in Indonesia's forest, if it would actually lead to like more sustainable, not sustainable, I don't even love that word anymore, but like equitable land use. So I think it's, you know, interesting to break things down into categories, but then also looking at the interconnections between them is helpful, if challenging.
I absolutely agree with you there. I think, you know, buying local is important to me for a lot of really social and economic reasons. But also I think it helps me to just stay connected to how my food is produced and who's producing it. And also helps me to stay connected to the kind of human side of food production, that food it doesn't come from nowhere, it comes from the labor of human beings. And that labor is too often minimized, not considered skilled labor, invisible to a lot of people. So the benefits of buying local are great, and they may spill over potentially into helping people to grapple with the climate impact of their food. But big asterisk, it is not enough. And my big gripe with localism is that it doesn't do a good job of addressing that complexity. It really doesn't, in my opinion. And climate impacts we urgently need to mitigate them. And we don't necessarily have time for a slow, cultural, really feel good kind of transition. I think it needs to be a bit faster than that. And so sometimes I find with some people, definitely not you, and probably not the people here, but some people cling to buying local as the thing that they can do so that they can feel like, you know, now everything's fine and I can eat as much meat as I want, because it's local. And that's not getting to it, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So it can be co-opted. What I've seen is that localism has been co-opted as a solution for climate change, but it just isn't. It's a solution for lots of things, but not for climate change.
I think the organic movement falls into much the same category too. During my lifetime, organics was considered the next thing that's going to save the planet, but then it just got co-opted by big business. And there is very little difference between big scale certified organic and big scale conventional agriculture, in my opinion.
Well, there's also actually not necessarily much difference in terms of climate impacts between organic and conventional.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm getting at.
Because of the yield gap, and because like even small scale organic and really well done organic agriculture wasn't designed to address climate change. It was designed to address soil health and toxicity and really those, you know, other important impacts. But it doesn't necessarily do a good job at addressing eutrophication and climate change, or, you know, if it uses a lot of land, biodiversity loss. So these are the binaries that we have to get away from. We really just need to learn and to design best practices in a local regional context. These are not easily sort of big brush solutions, in my opinion.
And I got another big one I want to bring up, but I want to give Doreen an opportunity. And I'd also like to hear Darren's presentation before I get into a whole other topic here.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
I can, yes.
About climate change, has the government accepted that we are going through a climate change? Because before they says we're not going, wait. My hair thing. Wait. Okay. I don't, everybody's gonna see me with my hair thing off. Okay. With my messy hair. Anyways, yeah, the government was trying to say, I worked on a climate change program, okay, on Tobic First Nations. And the government's trying to say that we don't have a climate change problem. Okay, so how is the government helping farmers with climate change, or are they helping you guys at all with the climate change? Because through lakes and forests and gathering and medicine, they're saying we're not going through a climate change.
Yeah, I think the government's reaction has so far been inadequate, and it's not going to get us there.
No, it's not.
New commitments are better. The new commitments are better, but still inadequate. And so I'm on a constant advocacy government schedule, and I think we all need to be.
Yeah, I think everybody should be, because with the government, they don't think that we're going through a climate change, which we are. So, because if they admitted that we're going through a climate change, that means they have to give up more funds to help with the climate change, which they don't want to, okay? Even with farming, if they admit that we're going through a climate change, yes, they have to compensate everybody, like especially farmers, with the climate change, and they don't want to do that. So that's why the little farmers and the little people have to stand up and fight for saying, yes, we are going through this climate change, right?
Yeah, it's extremely distressing when we don't see our alarm reflected in good policy and urgent change.
Then there's not a lot of adaptation support in the Maritimes currently. Like, this is a few years ago that I was looking into it, but I emailed and called people from each of the provincial, because we served all the Atlantic provinces, each of the provincial jurisdictions, and sometimes we have to wait a year to get a response on their own adaptation plan. In which it differs between province, but like I think in PEI they had like a table, and so they said they were going to develop educational programming or whatever, and that report came out, I don't know, a year before I was looking at it, and then I emailed and called and I got a response a year later that they hadn't started it yet. And similar in Nova Scotia, they started with adaptation, looking at the impacts of climate change for vineyards first, of course, because it's the most financially lucrative, and tourism and all that. I mean, that's my opinion, but I think that there's like a real lack of support going to farmers, and then a lack of support going to the organizations that support farmers in trying to learn about these things. Like, you guys know that ACORN doesn't really exist anymore, which is a financial problem because of funding and all sorts of things. But anyways, I have lots of opinions about that, but there needs to be more like extension from the government, because they have a lot of these modeling and information about technology use or adaptation planning, or like even projections, and yet it's not really getting to the people who need it and want it.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Nicole said. Like, just the advocacy is so important. Like, and I know it's exhausting with the government when they just like don't give a shit or just pretend they don't know, but like writing letters and like pestering people and like calling them all the time and like signing petitions. Like, I know it's not going to be the one thing that changes things, but I feel like if more people like pester the government over this stuff, then we might get like more movement. And I know a lot of people are just like, their day is full getting by, but it might be interesting to do some kind of like advocacy at the farm. I don't know.
Or even
don't want to mess up our government funding.
But even talking to some of the program officers directly, like when I was working for ACORN, we had a conversation with some season extension folks in the government and got them to amend the season extension infrastructure funding. I can't remember what it was called, but to include the ability to replace or repair things that were damaged by strong winds, because of the strong winds that were happening in New Brunswick at the time. But that actually didn't require like too much advocacy just required, like, I developed a relationship with a person and then did some consultation with farmers and then had a direct conversation where we amended the language. But so sometimes developing some of those relationships can be really, really fundamental. And they're open to changing some of the requirements and some of the programs if they hear from farmer organizations that it's important. You know, I think Nova Scotia, their Farm Start program, the amount that farms had to have in order to access it was fought back by the Nova Scotia Farm. I can't remember the group's name anymore, but anyways, they changed that based on feedback immediately. So I think sometimes just like a lack of communication. Anyways.
Yeah, there are some good folks within government, so those relationships are important. Also, if any, I don't know if you're all from New Brunswick, but if any of you are from Nova Scotia, the province of Nova Scotia is now undertaking a climate planning process, both mitigation and adaptation, which is good because so far the conversation has been all about adaptation and nothing about mitigation. It's sort of couched in the language of economic growth, so I'm nervous already, but if you're a Nova Scotian, please participate. The public consultations are going on right now, and it is absolutely critical that we participate in government, not just vote. Anyways.
And it's that economic angle that I wanted to inject in there too. But before I get down that road, because I can go off on a little bit there, I really want to get there in an adequate amount of time here and a fair amount of time to present what he has there. And I'm sure that we're going to have even more conversation stimulated by that. So Darren, please continue there.
Thanks, Nicole, Brittany. Thanks, Mark. Can you see some windmills and cows?
Yes.
Okay, and I'm coming through okay? You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So again, my name is Darren Qualman. I'm with the NFU, and my talk today is imagining a near zero emission food system. And I understand my remit is to be the ray of sunshine, but just before I move into that mode, I just want to underscore something that Nicole said, and that is just the gravity of this. And just the import of this. Some of those RCPs, some of those representative concentration pathways, will literally have civilization cracking effects. Like, this isn't just a weather phenomena. This is a end of the world as we know it phenomena. So this is really, really important. And I'll try and be more positive moving forward. But I just think we need to, before we can fully understand the solutions, we do need to just ponder the situation we're in. So just to give a little bit of background on the NFU, the NFU has been working on climate issues since 1997. More recently, we published the Tackling the Farm Crisis and the Climate Crisis report in 2019. In 2020, the NFU and other organizations created the Coalition Farmers for Climate Solutions, and I really urge everybody to go to the Farmers for Climate Solutions website. FCS is an amazing organization, really pleased to be part of that. In 2021, the NFU published the report, Imagine If, a vision of a near zero farm and food system for Canada, and I'm going to be talking about that in this presentation. And just in terms of some of that government work that's been mentioned before, as part of the Farmers for Climate Solutions Coalition, the NFU and other organizations and the FCF staff managed to get agriculture, climate, and emissions into the throne speech. That hadn't happened before. That led to it being in the ministerial mandate letter for the Minister of Agriculture. That hadn't happened before. And then a lot of the programs and policies were picked up and funded, most importantly funded, in budget 2021. Not nearly enough, but compared to a year ago, wow, what a big change. So we're not to where we want to be, but at least we're in the vehicle and accelerating. And it's an electric vehicle, it's a non-emission vehicle, by the way. I'm going to delve into some complex topics here. I hope I explain them in a way that everybody can comprehend. But just if you do want to know more about what we're doing, want some background, there's 3 2-page flyers on the NFU website under the climate tab. These are just 2-page introductions explaining what agricultural emissions are, what we can do, what farmers can do for long-term planning on their farm. So I just flag these resources if you want to know more. So there's been a lot of really great presentations so far about agricultural emissions, and I want to just give some specifics on Canadian agricultural emissions and then on New Brunswick emissions. So this is a graph that we've created. It covers agricultural greenhouse gas emissions in Canada over the last 28 years, 1990 to 2018. It's different than what the government usually produces because the government uses IPCC categories and it leaves out things like on-farm energy use, the production of agricultural inputs. And what we've done is we've kind of re-engineered this in order to create a much more comprehensive view of what emissions are in Canada. So it's kind of a complex looking graph, but really, and this has been mentioned previously by Nicole, really there's 3 main categories of emissions in agriculture. So starting at the top, those blue bands are livestock and manure. It's mostly cattle. The wide blue band, the dark blue, is enteric emissions, the methane coming out of the mouths of cattle when they digest forage and grass. Then in the middle, those red bands are carbon dioxide emissions from diesel fuel in tractors and other machinery, gas in farm trucks, natural gas used to heat buildings and barns, and also some of the emissions from the generation of electricity used on farms. Then on the bottom, we've got green bands, and those are emissions from soils and emissions from the production of fertilizer, but mostly that's nitrogen fertilizer you're looking at down there. Some manure, some natural processes, but most of that green area, 60+%, are related to nitrogen fertilizer. The light green is the carbon dioxide from the nitrogen fertilizer factories where it's made, and the dark green is the nitrous oxide from soils, and again, most of that's from nitrogen fertilizer. Sorry. So I'll just show you what the picture looks like in New Brunswick. Again, the categories are the same. At the top in green, we've got livestock and manure, mostly cattle. In the middle, that red band is fuel use. The tan colored band is larger in New Brunswick as a proportion than it is in Canada. A lot of that is lime applied to soils. And then at the bottom, we've got those blue bands, again, largely a function of nitrogen fertilizer. And I'll just show you a graph here. This little graph I've put in is the tonnage of nitrogen fertilizer used in the Atlantic provinces. And when we put that beside the emissions graph, we can see that the ups and downs of that nitrogen tonnage really mirror the ups and downs of the emissions at the bottom of that graph. And really that's what's driving the top line. New Brunswick agricultural emissions, and this is true of a lot of provinces, it's really a function of nitrogen fertilizer tonnage. The top line isn't really going up because farmers are using more or less fuel. It's not going up because there are more cattle. In the case of New Brunswick, cattle numbers are actually shrinking a little bit. The top line is largely a function of nitrogen fertilizer inputs and inputs in general. And I just want to really focus on that input use piece for a minute. One of the things we say in our analysis of agriculture emissions and climate change is that farming doesn't produce greenhouse gas emissions. It's farm inputs that produce greenhouse gas emissions. And that's a provocative statement. It's a bit of a generalization, but it's intentionally provocative. But here's the thing we know. We've got 10,000 years of data. And for 10,000 years, farmers farmed and they didn't affect the atmosphere or the climate. And it's only in the last 100 years that farmers have become ever more dependent on purchased inputs, that agriculture has been a really big source of emissions and a big climate problem. So really, when we're thinking about how to reduce emissions from agriculture, we need to think about the inputs going in, because the greenhouse gases coming out of one end of our linear agricultural system are largely a function of the petro-industrial inputs we're pushing in the other end. It's a flow-through system because it's linear, it's not circular. Just want to say a little bit about net income. This is a graph of New Brunswick gross farm revenue. That's the black line that goes up at the top. And net farm income, that's the gray line that unfortunately doesn't go up near the bottom. The periods over the last almost 100 years, it's 1926 to 2019. The periods over the last 100 years where net farm income was positive are in green. The periods where it's negative are in red. But I just want to focus on that blue area, the area between gross farm revenue and net farm income. That blue area represents farmers' expenses, the money they spend on farm inputs like fertilizer, fuel, seeds, bank interest, etc. And notice how that blue area gets wider and wider and wider. More and more of the wealth created by farmers, more and more of the money they earn when they sell agricultural products is being captured by those input providers, and that blue area gets wider and wider. The amount going to Bayer and John Deere and banks and others gets bigger and bigger. And I'll just put some numbers to those. From the end of the Depression until the mid-'80s, farmers were keeping almost half, 47% of every dollar that they earned. Since the mid-'80s in New Brunswick, that's down to 7%. The input suppliers are capturing about 93% of all the wealth generated on New Brunswick farms. And this ties into that emissions graph that I showed you before. Not only does overdependence on petro-industrial inputs drive emissions up, that overdependence on inputs drives net farm income down. And this is me with my ray of sunshine. That means that we've got this double win, that as we help farmers to shift away from their overdependence on petro-industrial inputs, emissions can go down, but equally important for farmers, margins and net incomes can go up. So there's a real win-win here. So I want to talk a little bit about our report from earlier this year, Imagine If, a vision of a near zero emission farm and food system for Canada. This is a very positive and very readable report. What it does is it takes the position, it invites readers to imagine that it's 2030, and to imagine that in Canada we did all the positive things that were necessary on our farms and throughout our food systems to really dramatically reduce emissions, increase sustainability, increase resilience, all of those things. And it's told in kind of a storybook way. You know, it says, here we are in 2030 on a farm in Alberta, and here's what's happening on that farm. And then it moves over to the Maritime, stops in Prince Edward Island, stops in New Brunswick, and shows just what a farm in 2030 might be doing differently to really deal with these emissions and adaptation and other problems we have. A lot of really good solutions there. So I can't really do it in a storybook way, but I'll just give you some of the highlights from the Imagine If report, how things might be different in 2030. As I said, a big driver here is nitrogen fertilizer. So in terms of nitrogen fertilizer in 2030, those farms are using it much more efficiently, using it with much more care using it with much more care. But efficiency is not enough. Efficiency alone doesn't really get us to where we want to go. We've got more efficient cars, but we just drive them more and emissions go up. So in addition to that efficiency, we also need to find alternatives like pulse crops and really reduce the tonnage. And part of that, and Brittany got at this in her presentation, a real focus on soils. Healthy soils retain water, they're more inherently productive. They host fungi and diversity of microorganisms, and they help reduce our reliance on purchased fertilizer inputs. To make those soils healthier and to retain that nitrogen in the soil, we utilize cover crops, improved rotations and perennials. And in addition to what's going on at the farm, you saw that band of emissions from fertilizer factories. We're going to have to change the emissions profile there. We're probably going to have to use carbon capture and storage or renewable energy in fertilizer production, and also really dramatically just reduce production and tonnage overall. We need to reduce fossil fuel use in agriculture and everywhere in our economy. So what does that look like on the farm? Well, we need to electrify everything possible. Use less diesel, use less gas, use less natural gas, etc. Electrify building, heating, water heating, etc. Electrify trucks and tractors. Electric trucks, pickup trucks are about a year away. Electric tractors are a little farther away, but there's no reason that small and medium-sized tractors couldn't be electric, zero emission. One NFU member in Ontario has got a Select Track tractor that they charge from their solar panel array, and they are essentially running, in operation at least, a zero emission tractor on that farm. On-farm solar, maybe some manure biodigesters. As in the rest of the economy, we need to retrofit those buildings so they're as efficient as possible. And when we build new farm buildings and houses, we need to use the best possible building practices like LEED, Passive House, and Net Zero. In order to help make this massive transformation, we need new agencies. The NFU has suggested to government that we create a new agency called the Canadian Farm Resilience Authority, the CFRA. And some of you may know, the last time we had a massive climactic disaster, the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, Canada responded by creating a PFRA, the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration. So we think that PFRA was a great idea. Unfortunately, it was canceled about a decade ago by the government that was in power at the time. But we think we should build on that PFRA and create a new CFRA that would oversee the transition to low input, low emission agriculture, to adaptation and to increasing resilience. It could hire and train 1,000 or more independent extension agrologists. So these would be extension agrologists that were not connected to farm input sellers, that weren't trying to just get farmers to use more fertilizer and chemicals, that instead could lead the way and support farmers to move to low input, low emission production systems. And the last big piece here I'll talk about, and we go into this in quite a bit of detail in the Imagine If report, the idea of food sheds. And I take really seriously what's been said about local food. There's limitations to that, but I think there's kind of a local food 3.0 that we can think about. And that's this concept of food sheds. So the reason these food sheds are important is not only that they produce local food, but they also begin to produce the first near zero emission food that we would have access to. So if you imagine a city that has agricultural land around it. In the report we talk about, I think Winnipeg and Edmonton as two examples. Those cities would buy up land in maybe a 40-kilometer radius of the city. They would allocate that land not based on ability to pay, but they would allocate it on preferential terms to anybody that was willing to farm it in sustainable, resilient, low emission ways. Maybe these might be young farmers, new Canadians, etc. So they give this land over to people willing to farm in low emission ways. They probably wouldn't use nitrogen fertilizer. Some of them might have access to electric tractors. So the on-farm production would be extremely low emission. And then the city could organize to pick that food up using low emission trucks on a regular schedule. It could be brought to markets and food ports that were spread throughout the city so that people could access that food by walking and biking and taking transit. And what results from these food sheds is potentially some quantity of near zero emission food for the city. It wouldn't be everything the city utilizes for sure, but it's very symbolic in a way because it begins to show people that food can be produced again with few or low emissions. And I was asked about this by a reporter, and they said, can this really be done? And I said, well, think about it. You know, cities have existed for about 5,000 years, and for about 4,900 years, they were fed by their surrounding farmland, by their food shed. And it's really only in the last 50 or 100 years, and only in a few places, as we've deployed this massive torrent of fossil fuels, that we've disconnected our cities from the surrounding food producing areas and instead provisioned them from hundreds or thousands of miles away. Mark, did you have a question? Your hand's up.
This reminds me of agroponicos in Cuba. Did they not prove that this works well in Cuba after the USSR crumbled? They were out of resources. They did some switches and they made these farms within cities. Sounds a lot like these food sheds.
Yeah. And there's a lot of urban and peri-urban, you know, food production in cities and around cities in other places. It's just in North America, we seem to have forgotten every good idea that we've ever known in human civilization, and we replace it with sort of these high input, high emission, high transport systems. So that's my presentation. I urge you to have a look at these two reports, the Tackling the Farm Crisis report from 2019 and the Imagine If report from 2021. The tackling report really goes into a lot of the problem description and sort of the things we can change on farm. And the Imagine If is more the ray of sunshine. It's the invitation to imagine, what if we get everything right? Not only what are the emissions reduction benefits, but all the other benefits throughout our food system in terms of democratization, participation, equity, inclusion, diversity, justice, a huge number of things. When, you know, as all of you will know, when we begin to solve some problems, we begin to solve a whole bunch of interrelated problems. And this gets back to that graphic we saw earlier about the food system, how everything really is connected. So thank you for your attention. Look forward to questions.
And again, I'll hold my tongue and let you guys have the opportunity first here. I want to, if nobody else is going to jump in, I want to weave together a couple of things from these various presentations here. There was talk about unpredictable weather, whereas this is going back to Brittany's presentation, whereas those averages on the surface to a grower in New Brunswick, it looks like, sweet, we get to have more growing, season. It's going to be warmer, we get to grow have longer season crops. But it's that unpredictability that comes in there, where you get those unpredictable frosts that ruin everything they have on the go. And then that result of that unpredictability, and you see that with Blaine Higgs' government trying to support operations that are now moving towards complete climate controlled operations, moving everything indoors in order to grow veg. And it seems to me anyway that that's exacerbating the climate situation, making it even worse by moving to a model where you can grow things independent of your climate. But at the same time, and this is going to weave in now into Nicole's presentation, it's the economic system that we currently live in that rewards producers for producing unique things above and beyond what their climate could naturally support. I know people that in Ontario that were trying to grow citrus in the hoop houses. I know of a farm in Ontario that's actually growing shrimp in Ontario. It's a former pork farm. Pork prices went down and they switched to shrimp in Ontario. And production of hothouse tomatoes in the middle of winter and all of these things. And I can speak from my own experience, you know, being first to market by using that black agricultural plastic and hoop house plastics and this kind of thing rewards you with more profit. And to me, this always comes down to the economic system. Yes, no? And it seems like economic reform, and that's where this food shed is leading, is where I start thinking down that way. It's that food shed system that was just presented by Darren sounds a lot to me like both land and economic reform. And I think that's like hitting the nail on the head there, is that economic reform is what's needed.
Well, and I really liked your graph, Darren, that showed like emissions going up, but because of inputs, but like income not like going down, because so many people kind of use that as an excuse. They're like, well, if you want to make a living, like this is how you got to do it. And so I think it's really like useful that someone's, graph that, and to be able to show producers that no, you're not profiting like the big corporations are. So I always like having evidence like that you can use for conversations.
And what's stopping, if that evidence is out there, farmers aren't dumb. What's stopping farmers from producing their own inputs again?
Yeah, farmers aren't irrational about this, but they are locked into a certain kind of system. They're locked in by their bankers, and they're locked in by sort of the logic. And this isn't by any stretch a full explanation, but if we just think our way through this, if we go down this path a little ways, farmers' margins get smaller. So the technology allows you to farm more acres, Roundup Ready, zero till, and it reduces your returns per acre. And what we're seeing, I'm just half hour south of Saskatoon in Saskatchewan here. What we're seeing is farmers deal with those declining per acre margins by farming more acres. And 5 to 10,000 acres isn't uncommon out here anymore. And so the technology simultaneously enables you to farm more and reduces your margins, so you have to farm more. So you get sort of caught in this horrible positive feedback that has very negative results. This is almost obscene, but there's a farmer in southern Saskatchewan who is boasting that he and his extended family are cropping 230,000 acres this year.
And the fact that you have to do that to make a living is obscene. Like, that's an extraordinary amount of land.
Yeah, to be clear, I mean, if they can pull it off, they will make more than a living. They'll make a lot of money, but it could do a big economic faceplant if there's a drought, and it could economically crash pretty quick.
I just wanted to say something about economics as well, just picking up on your point. I think that you're absolutely right to draw that thread between the three of our talks. And looking at this from an ecological economics perspective, we would say that this is an issue of scale. It's not necessarily that we have too many people on the planet, but an economy whose primary purpose is growth, not sufficiency or well-being for all, or any of the sort of positive social benefits that we expect our governments and our economies to deliver, just sort of as a matter of course. We have been sold a bill of goods and told that we can't have those things without growth. And so, when we receive our economic reports from our governments and they say, things slowed down during COVID, but we're growing again, and everybody, that's good. We assume that they are telling the truth, but they aren't necessarily, not because they're lying necessarily, but because they may believe a falsehood. There's an extraordinary amount of research to show that there's no empirical evidence to support the contention that our economy can just grow indefinitely to any scale, and that will be good. And in truth, what we are already observing, and we have been for some time on a number of different ecological fronts, but also on social fronts, as in justice and equity, that these are not taken for granted goods. And a system that was built around sufficiency and well-being would have very different priorities and would not prioritize the profits of big agribusiness giants. Just, we would consider it a matter of public survival that their profits be capped, that there be a maximum amount of money that they can make, and the rest just would have to be distributed, or not even, not even done at all. Because what feeds growth is extraction, and in the case of the global south, exploitation, and in the case of our farm labor, exploitation, as Darren very clearly showed. And the stress on them, I receive a kind of monthly e-newsletter from a farmer that I buy most of my veggies from. And the stress of being part of an exploited class of people who are nonetheless extremely well-educated, well-skilled, and hardworking is evident in every single one of his emails. And it's wrong.
If I can just add to that, I just want to give a 1-minute micro class on growth economics. Some of you will know this. If you have a growth percentage and you want to figure out how long it'll take for the system to double, you take 70 and divide it by the growth percentage. So in Canada, we're aiming for just under 3% growth on average every year. 70 divided by 3 is close enough to 25 for our purposes. So that would be a system that would double in size every 25 years. It would double 4 times in 100 years. So it would go 2, 4, 8, 16. So a 3% growth rate, which sounds great in a year, gives you an economy that's 16 times larger a century from now, which sounds impossible, but that's exactly what happened in the 20th century. In the 20th century, the Canadian and most of the global economy increased 16-fold in size, and we have a pathological political, economic, corporate class who wants to do that again in the 21st century and make the Canadian and other economies 16 times larger. Well, it's hard to decarbonize, but it's really, really hard to decarbonize if you're committed to making the economy 16 times larger.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. 3% doesn't sound exponential, but it is, because it compounds yearly. Yeah. Yeah, and these are the things that we simply as society are not very asleep to, and somehow that's the challenge. That's the underpinning challenge of all of this. Yeah.
And there's more ambitious targets set by other countries out there too than just that 3%, is there not?
Well, Chinese growth rates are just astonishing. Not to take, China starts from a much lower thing, and not to in any way transfer the blame from them, because it's our consumption that's driving a lot of this. But a lot of countries are growing 6-8%.
I was wondering, as a way to attempt to wrap here today, do you have any examples? Does anybody have any examples of any high-performing, low-emission farms that currently exist that we can learn from? Oh man, I was really hoping for something here, guys.
Yeah, oh no.
I mean, that's a very difficult question to answer, because to what extent are emissions actually being measured and calculated on any individual farm? So there's, this is the modeler in me, right? I think that there are some really good examples, and of course there are, and there are lots of farmers going in the right direction. This farmer that I was just talking about is doing a lot of things for which he gets, which cost him thousands of dollars a year, around soil conservation and proper water management, and decreasing inputs dramatically on his farm. He's not an organic farmer, but his farm is his family legacy, and his children want to take it over, his adult children. And so it's very important, the conservation of his farm operation and decreasing inputs, very important to him. But to point to any individual farm and say, okay, well, this farm is doing it, would require that we actually measure their performance.
Well,
so I think that's happening.
As a farmer, I'm looking for these examples. I want to see something that I can copy and be happy with and go down that road.
Well, I wonder if there would be, like, I know all like calculators are going to be incomplete, but I know there's like individual tools for like calculate your carbon impact as an individual. And it might be a helpful tool for farmers because sometimes, like, you know, in my life, I've made changes and I thought this was going to be like a big change. And then you're like, oh, that's just making me feel better. Like recycling, it's not actually helping, but we do it because it makes us feel good. So that's, you know, maybe wasted energy. But if there was like a calculator that would actually help you identify from a farm level or whatever, that could be a really cool tool because then you could make modifications where it would actually have impact.
There's one in Canada called Holos. It's an on-farm calculator. I haven't used it myself, but I think it's based on sound principles and it's always being updated. And I, as I understand, maybe Darren, you could comment. I believe farmers are using it to try to test the progress towards climate mitigation goals, emission reduction goals. So these tools already exist and can be used. And the nice thing about them is that you need to be able to take into account your local soil conditions, your local climate conditions, not just your inputs. I don't know if we've gotten to the point with Holos where we can take into account like actual soil measurements of where your soils are starting from, because that also impacts emissions. But these tools are getting more and more sophisticated, and they're increasingly available to farmers via apps and things like that. But again, it's placing a lot of burden on farmers who already have a lot to do in their day. So that burden needs to be distributed more fairly.
And at Hayes Farm here, that was a path that we started going down in the late winter here with Louise Como's help. And it became evident that it was larger than we could possibly take on with our core staff that we have here and still maintain programming and everything else. So I see where you're coming from, Nicole, and saying that it's another job for farmers to do who are already wearing many hats. And it's something that we have shelved in the time being just to get the season going, but it's something we intend to revisit there again and during the off season and try to make more progress on this. Although I'll be honest, I don't quite know where to start, which is why we reached out to Louise there.
I think this is where Darren's comment about farm extension support is so important. That's where the research needs to be happening. This needs to be public science.
Yeah, I think I'd make two brief comments on your question, Mark. One, you know, I can suggest farms that have solar panels charging electric tractors and others that are making great steps. And I'm sure on your own farm there, you're farming in a very low emission way. But the other thing is, and measurement needs to be done for sure. But in another way, it's much more simple than that. For most of human history, farms were very ultra low emission. And even today, in places outside of North America and Europe, et cetera, there's still a lot of farming going on that is very, very low emission, where they don't use inputs, et cetera. But the other thing too, though, and this has been said, it's a whole system change. You know, what people want to eat, when they want to eat it, how much they waste, that all comes together in figuring out what our emissions footprint is going to be from food. So farms are going to have to shift in concert with a lot of other shifts that are taking place throughout the entire society and civilization.
And thank you very much for that. That's one of the things that made me want to move out and try this Hayes project as well. I was farming in Ontario. My main market was Toronto. It was an hour and a half drive one way. I would also have folks from Toronto come out to the farm, and it was a lot of traveling. And not only the farm emissions, but the individuals coming to your farm, it all adds up as well. And so having this acreage right inside of Fredericton is a game changer. I really like that. I really like that people can come over and bike over and walk over and pick up veg, and it's fantastic.
I would also say that, you know, just from my experience working at Acorn, like creating some of those connections locally, I think is really important. It's not happening as much as I think it should. It's not being supported to happen from the government or otherwise. You know, I think we experienced, even the short time that we had that project, which was about a year, people learning about their practices and starting to do different things and sharing how it was going and, you know, specific to their location and some of the things that are being experienced specific in the Maritimes. I think that's really valuable information, but it's really not getting shared or, and now that there's not really an organization taking on that on, and the government certainly isn't, the burden of doing that kind of organizing is entirely put on farmers. And I don't think that that's fair, you know, and there's a lot of information like at DAL and other institutions that, and in the government, that know what's happening and they have ideas of how to solve these things, but it's not, there's not accessible information, which I think is also another big problem. Like the government can only do so much, but if they're not willing to tone down the government speak and speak to people in a language that they speak and meet them where they're at, like going to farm communities and hosting workshops and things like that in a post-COVID time, it's not going to happen, you know, and I don't think that that burden should be put on farmers to figure that out for themselves. I don't know what the solution is there, but I think there needs to be more of that that kind of thing. And yeah, then you'll know more about what other people are doing that are working in the area. You know, if we're all like, oh, I don't know what other people are doing currently, it clearly points to the fact that there's a lack of communication amongst the community.
Which is why I like Acorn, bringing people together.
Yeah, hopefully it comes back a bit stronger in the future.
Yep. All right, fellas, we're at 4 o'clock. I think we ran out of time here. Much thanks to our guest speakers. I think we're going to wrap here unless there's anyone with any final questions or comments. Going once, going twice. All right, we're wrapping. Thanks, Brittany and
Thanks so
Darren and
much.
Nicole, so much. That was a very good afternoon spent. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Nice to see you.
Bye.
Thanks. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you.